Well, so far we've talked all about all the cool things that Andrew Jackson did as president. So if he was such a cool guy, brave, strong, courageous, all this stuff, why are we thinking of taking him off the $20 bill? Well, it's the issue of Native Americans is the big issue. I mean, yes, he owned slaves. He was not the only one. And you kind of have to look at him as part of his time. But we're going to be looking at his policy with Native Americans, and this is where it really becomes difficult for us to kind of admire who he was. Right now, people who liked Andrew Jackson called him Old Hickory because he was tough. He was the hardest wood in creation. Native Americans had a different name. They called him Sharp Knife. Now I don't know if it sounds cool or not. He got this name because of his reputation for ruthlessness in battle, which means he didn't play nice, right? When it comes to fighting, he was all in, and he played to win. And in war, I guess you kind of have to, right? He was a good general. He was a good a soldier, and he would win the battles. That's what he fought. He would fight to win. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to kill the enemy. And most of his wars that he fought in were against Native Americans. So that's why the Native Americans, they called him Sharp Knife. They respected him. They knew that he was a tough enemy. And you don't want to fight somebody who's going to go all out to kill you. So in 1817, President James Monroe ordered Colonel Jackson to go fight against the Native Americans in Georgia, specifically the Seminole and the Creek Indians. Now these were Native Americans who lived in the South, and the Seminoles particularly were actually really, really good fighters and were really tough to defeat. And Jackson fought a long war against them, but proved successful. He was able to defeat them, he was able to capture their territories, and force them into reservations. Jackson really had no sympathy for Native Americans. That means he didn't feel sorry for them. He didn't feel like they deserved a chance. He said they were in the way. Right? While he was president, his national policy to remove Native Americans from the East by force, which means he moved them. He forced them to leave their homes and go somewhere else. So this is a picture of Andrew Jackson. He defeated the Creeks, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. They had to sign a treaty that they would give up the lands that they lived on for generations, and give up their land in Georgia and Alabama. Why did they have to give up their land? Why couldn't they just stay where they were? So here's a map of the United States and its territories in 1828 to 1834. The pink areas, those are the states of the United States. So if you're living in the states, that means that you had an organized government, you were a citizen, you had all the things that a government has, roads and banks and post office, all those things. They're all part of living in the states, kind of like what you live today. The kind of yellowish orange is what we call territories. Territories are places that belong to the United States, but they don't have an organized government. They might have a governor, but you notice that these territories are kind of big, and so they're not going to be as well organized. They're not going to be as all the services that you would have. States, remember, they're allowed to vote for the president. Territories, not necessarily, right? You don't necessarily get to vote for your governor and that kind of stuff, right? But anyway, so let's look at some of these territories. Michigan Territory, those were about to become a state. You became a state once you get, like, I think it was 10,000 people move in, and then you can become a state. You can petition to become a state. Florida had come to the United States from Spain. The United States bought bought Florida from Spain. Arkansas, Oregon, and that was all part of the Louisiana Purchase. The unorganized territory. That means it belonged to the United States because they had bought it from France, but there wasn't really any kind of government there. It was, if you notice, that's mostly the Great Plains of the United States, and that's where a lot of Native Americans were. Oregon country, that was shared with the United Kingdom. It was unorganized, which means there really wasn't any government there. People just kind of ran their own lives. And of course, Mexico. Mexico, of course, is a totally different country. Notice that it covers a whole bunch of territory, including California. Right? And we also have Russian America, which is today's Alaska, and Hawaii, which was its own independent country. Now here's where the conflict starts. White settlers, people who were from European descent, they all came to the East Coast, living on the East Coast, and it was crowded. There were lots of people living there, but there's not very much land. And if you wanted to work in a factory, that's where you'd stay. But if you wanted to become a farmer, you wanted to own your own land, because remember, that was what made you rich back then. If you owned your own land, you had to go west, right? You had to go west. There's all this territory. Remember, the unorganized territory didn't really belong to anybody except for the Native Americans. Remember, so really had a different concept of what owning land meant. They didn't. Native Americans, remember, if we talked about in chapter 1, didn't really believe that people could own the land. The land owned the people. So they kind of they went from one place to another and didn't really try to dominate the land. Well, white people were different. Americans were different. They said, you need to chop down all the trees, create a farm, build a house. You do all that, you own the land because you have improved it. Now, so they were running into the Native Americans, and that caused conflict because when the Native Americans, they would come back. They try to go to the place where they had always gone for generations, and all of a sudden there are these white people living there who have chopped down all the trees, killed all the deer, killed all the buffalo, and that's caused all this conflict between them because Native Americans, well, they still wanted to live there, and the white Americans, well, they were afraid of the Native Americans. They read too many books and stories about fighting between Indians and stuff. Well, the national government, which would be the president before Jackson, kind of had to follow George Washington's idea. And Washington kind of respected the Native Americans, and he wanted to give them a place. He wanted to protect their rights. And so, the national government made treaties with the Native Americans. That means they signed an agreement with them. They agreed not to fight each other, that the Native Americans would go live over here, white Americans would live over here, and that way you'd keep the peace. Right? Native Americans would give up part of their land. They would exchange for food, supplies, and they promised that we will keep you in your land forever. Right? Give us this little part, and for the white people and the Native Americans, you get to keep the rest of it for all eternity. I mean, nobody will ever bother you. And that would create the peace for a couple of years until the white people said, no, we need the rest of the Indian territory too. And they would start crowding out the other Native Americans. Right? And so this was the policy of the federal government, to try to make peace and try to respect the rights of Native Americans. Now, even though these treaties were the law and the government was supposed to protect the Native Americans, white people kept on pushing them off their land. More and more people came from the east, and they kept on going further and further west because that's where the land was. Everybody wanted more. Everybody wanted a place to live. Everybody, just wanted their own house, their own dream of owning their own land and stuff. And they kept pushing the Native Americans off. And the Native Americans would complain to the government. The government would Sometimes they would try to help them, sometimes they would just kind of ignore them, and Native Americans kept on getting pushed out. Jackson wanted to settle this once and for all, and he said, "Fine, we need to move all Native Americans out of the United States. Take them out of the states. We're going to send them all to a new Indian territory. We're going to put all the Native Americans somewhere else, a new territory near what we today is called Oklahoma." And so, moving them out is from, you can see on the map, moving them out of there where they lived in Georgia and Alabama, moved them across Mississippi, across Arkansas, across the Mississippi till they reached what is called Oklahoma or Indian Territory. Now, by this time, the only Native Americans left in the East Coast were what lived in the southern states. They belonged to what we call the five tribes: Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. These tribes had tried to live with white people, right? They said, we're going to call them the five civilized tribes. Their leader, Tecumseh, said, we are going to no longer be Native Americans. We're going to be, just regular people. We're going to build our own farms. We're going to go to school. We're going to learn to read, to write. We're going to, become Christian. We're going to do all these things to try to fit in with the white people, right? And we'll have our territory here. We'll buy and sell, and we'll be good Americans, right? And try to live in peace. However, as the biggest crop back down there was cotton, and the people growing cotton wanted more and more territory to grow more and more cotton because, they were getting rich off of it, and so the cotton comes from a plant, and you need lots of big farms to grow it and lots of slaves. And they were looking at the Native Americans' land and said, we need to take it over. So they wanted to take the homeland of those five tribes, and not just rich white people, but poor white people too. And so they began to tell Jackson, we need to move them out of the way. So in 1830, President Jackson urged Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. This is the law by which Native Americans would trade their territory in the South for territory in the Great Plains, which sounds okay, right? You're going to trade this land for this other land over here, but the land that they were giving up was rich, it was settled, it was cleared, it was good for farming, which is why the white plantation owners wanted it. The land that they would be getting was dry, dusty, really not good for anything. And here's the other thing: if you didn't make the trade, you had to, right? The military would force you to do it. Then President Jackson would send the army to go, and Congress passed this, right? Congress passed it, but not everybody was for it. The Congressman Davy Crockett, remember him? He voted against it. He thought it was stupid, and he respected the rights of Native Americans. The civilized tribes, remember, they went to education, they learned how to do things, so they sued. They sued and said, this law is unconstitutional. You can't take away our territory, and we're American citizens too. You made this treaty. You signed a treaty with us saying that we get to own the land in perpetuity, which means forever. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with them. The Supreme Court said, this territory, this land, you made a deal with them. You have to honor the deal. You have to obey the law. Well, Andrew Jackson disagreed. He said, you want to protect the Native Americans, you do it, right? I'm sending the army. And he defied the Supreme Court. He ignored what the Supreme Court had to say and just kind of ordered the army to go and force any Native American who didn't want to go to leave, right? By force. All right, so let's take a look at the map. You can see in the dark green the Native American territory, the Chickasaw and Choctaw in Mississippi, the Cherokee Creek in Alabama and Georgia, and the Seminole down in Florida. Where they would be relocated to is Oklahoma, the kind of yellow-green area, and you see the lines drawn to where it's going. Notice a couple things. The Seminole, where the Seminole lives in Florida, is known as the Everglades. It's a kind of a almost jungle, rainforesty kind of place. It rains a lot. There's lots of water. That's the kind of territory they're used to. Oklahoma is dry. It's almost desert-like. It's flat. There's no hills there, and very little water. So it's a totally different situation, and it's more than 1,000 miles away, right? More than 1,000 miles from where the Native Americans were used to living. Now take a look at this picture. This is the popular representation of what the trail of the Indian relocation was pictured at. If you look at there are soldiers there. You know, the guy in blue. You know, he's carrying a gun, but the gun is around his back. He's riding a horse, and he's just kind of like riding along, trying to make sure that everybody stays safe. The Native Americans, the Cherokee, they look pretty warmly dressed, right? They're all riding horses. Some of them are walking, but they've got backpacks. They got wagons to carry the really heavy stuff. It looks it looks not so bad, does it? On the land it's fairly flat. They might be cold, but they're really warm dressed. So why is this called the Trail of Tears? This was how history books and how Americans always thought of the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees, well, we're really sad that they had to move, but it wasn't so bad. They're moving to a new place. Everybody has to move at one time or another, right? Well, there were people who were against this, but looking at pictures like this, I guess it's not so bad. Well, it's called the Trail of Tears because, well, this picture is probably a little bit more accurate. If you look at the picture, the Native Americans, they look cold. It doesn't look like none of them have horses. They're all walking. They're just kind of like wearing like old blankets, and there's snow. It's snow there. The trail really was a trail of tears. So by 1836, thousands of Creeks who refused to leave were rounded up, and they were marched west in handcuffs with soldiers guarding them, making sure they did it. 2 years later, President Martin Van Buren carried out the Indian Removal Act. 17,000 Cherokee were forced from their homes, headed west by federal troops. Over 7,000 American soldiers were there to guide them, to force them to keep on going. They were kicked out and they had to leave, and they started marching in the middle of winter. It was winter time, so it was cold, it was wet. They didn't have enough supplies. They didn't have enough wagons. They didn't have enough. Out of those 17,000, over 4,000 died from starvation and disease. Starvation meaning they didn't get enough food to eat. They were forced to walk, and they were sick. When you're weak from hunger and you're walking a lot, your body's not as strong, and so it's really easy to catch disease. The Cherokee called this the Trail of Tears, and was kind of the reason why there are no Native Americans on the East Coast anymore. The exception, I think there are some Seminoles who hid out in the rainforest and, well, still exist there to this day.